and all of a sudden I heard the shooting.
On April 30th, 1970, President Richard Nixon addressed the country on national television to tell viewers that he would be expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia. Protests erupted across the country. Universities were prominent gathering sites for students who felt that there should be an end to the war, but instead were told that it was expanding. Students at Princeton, Yale, UC Berkeley, Irvine, Los Angeles gathered together to protest the expanding war. These are all campuses that are known for their progressivism, but even unsuspecting universities such as Kent State University, a state college in Ohio, not only participated, but suffered the consequences while rooting for peace. This video is largely based off the book 67 Shots by Howard Means, which I recommend if anyone wants to read it. I think it's a very good book, and we'll come to the conclusion why the title's name is 67 Shots, but I'm going to carry on with the video. On May 1st, the day following Nixon's address on Cambodia, students on the Kent campus were furious with the outcome. A small group of mainly graduate students held a rally where they buried the U.S. Constitution beside the Victory Bell, implying the death of the Constitution, as Nixon had sent troops into a country and did not declare war on Cambodia or consult with Congress. After a day of rallying, like college students do on Friday nights, the students went to local clubs downtown. There were a lot of emotions going on that night after Nixon's speech, with some alcohol and no authority watching over them, as there was only 2 police officers downtown. The students began to gather outside and watch some bikers to do some tricks. The crowd soon became very rowdy, and one of the students threw a bottle at one of the cop cars, which prompted the police to pull back and stop patrolling the area. The crowd continued to grow, now numbering well over 500 students. And as tensions rose, more students flowed into the street. A car that was going through the street trying to steer clear of the chaos sped through, narrowly missing several pedestrians. And this further enraged the crowd, which then made them unleash their anger onto nearby shops. What they did was break 45 windows of shops nearby, including jewelry stores and banks, and they had no one around to stop them for roughly an hour and a half. The students pillaged many stores. That is, until a 30-person force of police arrived. They used tear gas canisters to push back the students to Kent State campus, finishing the job at around 2 a.m. The Friday night riot gave Kent residents enough proof to think that radicals were targeting their city. At 12:47, just minutes after declaring a state of emergency, the mayor, Leroy Satcham, called the office of Ohio Governor James A. Rhodes. Satcham informed Rhodes' staff about the unrest going on in Kent. As a result, a National Guard officer was sent to the area to assess the situation. The morning after the uproar in downtown Kent, many shopkeepers were in their stores waiting for students, and if anything, they were hoping for students to come by with their weapons in hand loaded. Saturday evening, a group of Black Panthers came into the cafeteria to have Carolyn Mallon as their witness, because as they claimed, they are going to burn down the ROTC building. By they meant the other students on Kent campus. And at around 8:20, there was a crowd surrounding the ROTC building. Many of the onlookers began to throw rocks, which broke windows, and then they threw flares inside, which slowly started to catch things on fire. Maybe out of shock, maybe for fear for their lives, I don't really know. Only the administration can say. But the administration only stood nearby and watched, not doing anything to stop the students. That is, until Professor Glenn Frank came yelling at the administration to call for help. When the firefighters arrived, they could only get their houses out when they decided to retreat. They had no help from law enforcement, and law enforcement was not that far, since KSU police had a station on campus. By 9:30, the building had no hope of being saved. By this point, the National Guard officer who was sent to assess the situation had now reported back to General Canterbury and was requesting assistance. That assistance would be in the form of a 900-person force of National Guard troops. Unfortunately, the Guard was there, but not yet ready to prevent the students from burning down the ROTC building. By Saturday morning, the Guard did have more control over the situation, managing to partially calm down the students and set up some roadblocks going into Kent. The city was essentially a military town, with guardsmen patrolling and stationed on many corners of the streets. On Monday morning, KSU was filled with armed National Guards. Continuous days of unrest would not just stop suddenly, and the students prepared to rally, not concerned about violating the prohibition on groups of people. Sometime after 11:30, about 50 angry students joined Jim Vaccarella in his dorm room in preparation for the day rally. After the students had pre-gamed the protest, as you would, they began to gather. The protest started off as yelling about the Guard's presence on campus, only making up about 50 people. The protesters were no real threat to the Guard. Students began to get more rowdy as the minutes went on. They yelled obscenities, made rude comments, and also made rude gestures, as you would assume. And the Guardsmen's main source of deterrent was tear gas, which was mostly ineffective due to high wind speeds, and there were some students who tossed back the tear gas at the Guardsmen. This was not a large group of thousands or hundreds of students, however, and this was mainly a group of unorganized kids. They were mainly made up of 20-year-olds. They weren't that old or experienced. However, there were still students in the background of the campus. Either they were curious, walking to class, or just some wanted to look at the lilacs, which is true. However, the Guardsmen themselves were also not that coordinated, as many of them were young. If anything, they were the same age as the protesters that day. During the chaos unfolding, the Guard positioned themselves in a compromising area. The National Guard officers were ordered to retrace their steps up what is known as Blanket Hill. Unfortunately, at 12:24 p.m., May 4th, 1970, a group of Guardsmen with no clear orders turned around and fired on students. They had loaded M1 rifles, and not the entirety of the Guardsmen, but a group of them shot 67 shots in 13 seconds. And what happened in those 13 seconds would traumatize hundreds of students for the rest of their lives. This wasn't an incident that traumatized them for years, if not or for their entirety of their life. In those 13 seconds, 13 students would be hit, 4 of which died. They would be Jeffrey Miller, Allison Cruz, William Schroeder, and Sandra Lee Schroeder. They would be fatally wounded that noon by National Guards officers. I have my notebook right here, and I do want to talk about some students specifically. John Clary was shot in the chest. Joe Louis was shot twice, one in the wrist, one on the leg. I remember Joe Louis's story specifically. I don't even have it written down. He was holding a middle finger up at one of the officers, and that officer fired at his arm, which hit his wrist, and then his leg. And then he began yelling, "Oh my God, they shot me." Which, imagine being a student on campus and listening to that. I think it's insane. And then there's Dean Keller, who quickly took cover in the parking lot, laid nearby a car, and maybe in a place where he thought he would be safe. Unfortunately, a bullet hit him in his lower spine, and has been lodged there ever since. And he was paralyzed for the rest of his life due to guards who had unclear orders. After the shootings, no one had empathy for the students. Many townspeople would say things like they should have shot more, and for the families of the wounded, they only received $50,000. $50,000 for 13 students, and most of that went to Dean Keller, which I think it makes sense. He is the one who is most impacted. He's going to be paralyzed for the rest of his life. If I remember correctly, he later became a American or U.S. history teacher and taught about the incident that he was in. But no one was charged in any way for the deaths of these students. Moments after the shootings took place, the guardsmen began to order students to disperse once more. Hundreds of students who had just watched 13 of their peers fall under gunfire. If it was not for Glenn Frank, who had earlier told authorities on campus to ask for help, then maybe many students might also not be here today. He cried and pleaded with students to go back to their dorms, and they eventually listened. In the end, the tragedy at Kent State leaves more questions than answers. What if the police had stepped in during the Friday night riot? What if the ROTC building had been protected before it was too late? What if the guardsmen had been given clearer orders, or given other means to disperse the crowd? What if restraint had been shown, or conversations had been had before those weapons were raised? We will never know. What we do know is that in 13 seconds, a chain of decisions and failures to act changed the lives of students, families, and a nation forever. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, there's another one right before it that talks more about Nixon's address on Cambodia and a secret shooting that happened there. But subscribe, like, and enjoy your day.